You know, sometimes the most intense drama isn't on screen, it's actually playing out in a courtroom.
Yeah.
And right now in India, there's this fascinating legal tussle happening.
Hmm.
It's all centered around Waqf. It's this ancient Islamic tradition, basically dedicating property forever for charity like mosques, schools, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. It's like setting up a permanent charitable trust, but with deep roots in Islamic practice. The idea is that the property itself is locked in, perpetually for these specific community purposes.
And the scale is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. We could be talking about over 600,000 properties.
Easily. Covering millions of acres across the country. It's not just a minor thing, it's a significant landholding.
Right. But as you can imagine, managing something that vast and that old, well, it hasn't always been smooth sailing. There have been issues, right? Disputes,
Right.
mismanagement.
Oh, definitely. Lots of challenges over the years in overseeing it all effectively, which brings us to this new law, the Walk Amendment Act, 2025.
Okay, yeah. The stated aim was modernization, tackling those management issues.
That's the official line, yes, to sort of update the system.
But here's where it gets really, really interesting. The central government, just a little while ago, May 21st, 2025, they went to the Supreme Court and made a pretty startling claim.
What was that?
They argued that Waqf, it's actually not an essential part of Islam.
Wow. Okay. That is a big statement,
Yeah.
considering how tied it is to Islamic history and charity.
Exactly. It definitely raises eyebrows. So that's what we're diving into today, this core argument, what the new act actually changes, and, why this whole thing matters way beyond just legal circles.
Sounds good. It's a crucial issue with lots of layers.
So let's kick things off with that central claim, not an essential part of Islam. The Solicitor General, Tushar Mehta, he argued this for the center. What was the actual reasoning? How do they justify saying that?
Well, the main thrust of their argument seems to be distinguishing between the purpose of the Waqf property, which might be religious or charitable, and the actual work the Waqf boards do.
Okay.
They're saying the board's job, managing the property, dealing with finances, legal stuff, these are essentially secular functions. They're focused on the administration, the practical side, not religious doctrine itself.
Right. So it's like the difference between, say, a priest performing a ritual and the church treasurer managing the collection plate. Two different roles.
That's a good analogy. And they apparently used another one in court, something called the biryani.
Yeah, that one stuck out. Comparing waf to biryani just being rice and spices. I mean,
It's memorable, if maybe a bit simplistic. But the point they're trying to hammer home is that the management activity itself isn't inherently religious, even if the outcome serves a religious or community purpose.
and this thinking directly connects to another controversial part of the act, doesn't it? The part about allowing non-Muslims on waqf boards.
Exactly. Because if the job is primarily secular property management, then their argument follows that you don't necessarily need to be Muslim to do it well. You need administrative skills, financial know-how, legal expertise.
Regardless of your personal faith.
Precisely. They're saying expertise should be the key qualification for those roles, not religious affiliation, because the tasks themselves aren't religious duties in their view.
Okay, I think I get the logic behind their argument, even if it's controversial. So let's pivot to the act itself, the Waqf Amendment Act 2025. What are the specific changes causing all this legal heat?
Well, one of the biggest ones, and really significant, is getting rid of something called Waqf by user.
Waqf by user. Explain that a bit.
So for a long, long time, the understanding was if a piece of land or property was consistently and openly used for religious or charitable purposes, like, say, a prayer ground everyone used, it could be recognized as Waqf, even without formal deed documents.
Just based on longstanding practice.
Exactly, based on how it was actually used by the community. But the center's arguing now that this lack of formal documentation creates legal ambiguity and potential for misuse. So the new act insists on formal registration, proper paperwork.
Okay, so it's about tightening things up legally. But the flip side, I mean, what about places where documents were lost? Or maybe never existed, going back generations? Isn't there a risk of invalidating genuine traditional wafs? It feels a bit like saying your grandmother's famous cake recipe isn't valid because she never wrote it down formally.
That's a perfect analogy, actually. That's precisely the criticism. People are worried this will disregard historical practice and potentially dispossess communities from properties that have served charitable purposes for ages, just because the paper trail isn't perfect by modern standards.
Okay, so that's a major shift. What else? We mentioned non-Muslims on the boards.
Yes, the Act explicitly allows for that. And again, the justification from the center is Property management is secular. Expertise matters most.
But the opposition view.
The opposition sees Waqf as fundamentally rooted in the Islamic community and its values. They worry that having board members who don't share that background might lead to decisions that aren't fully aligned with the cultural or religious ethos of these institutions. It's not just about managing assets, it's about stewardship of something culturally specific.
Like asking someone who doesn't understand the rules or spirit of cricket to manage a cricket club, maybe?
Something like that, yeah. There's a concern about a potential disconnect with the core purpose and values.
Makes sense. What about the central government's own role? Does the act give them more say?
Oh, definitely. Significantly more. The
Eh,
Act increases the center's power over things like how Waqfs are registered, how their accounts are audited, the oversight of finances,
And the reasoning for that is?
transparency, and accountability. The government says this is needed to tackle corruption and make sure these valuable assets are managed properly,
Right.
given the past issues we talked about.
Okay, a top-down approach for better management. But I can already hear the counter-argument. Potential power grab. Undermining the state-level whack boards, maybe adding more bureaucracy.
That's exactly the concern raised by critics.
Mhm.
They worry it centralizes too much power, takes away autonomy from state boards who might understand local situations better, and could potentially slow things down with more central oversight. It's that classic tension efficiency versus local control.
Right. And there's one more piece here, the district collectors. What's their new role?
The Act gives district collectors, the main administrative officers in a district, the authority to decide if a disputed property is Waqf land or if it belongs to the government.
So a local official gets to settle these often very complex land disputes.
Yes, the idea is to provide a quicker mechanism for resolving these long-running ownership battles, which often tie up properties for years in courts.
On paper, that sounds practical, maybe cutting through legal delays. But again, downsides.
Yeah.
Giving that power to a local administrator, it feels like, I don't know, asking the DMV to rule on historical land claims. Is there enough expertise there?
That's the worry. Critics point to the potential for, administrative overreach or decisions made without a deep understanding of specific Waqf laws and the history of the property. It puts a lot of weight on the collector's judgment in potentially very sensitive cases.
Okay, so with all these changes, walk by, user gone, non-Muslims on boards, more central control, new powers for collectors, it's maybe no surprise the act ended up in the Supreme Court.
Not at all.
So what's the court actually being asked to do? This was unfolding around May 21st, right?
Yeah, the hearings were intense then. The petitions hitting the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Sanjeev Khanna, are essentially challenging the Act's constitutionality.
Arguing it violates religious freedom.
Exactly. That's a core argument, infringement on Article 25 and 26 of the Constitution, which protect religious freedoms. Some are asking the court to scrap the entire act. Others want at least a temporary freeze-a-stay on implementing these really contentious sections we've discussed.
And the center's response, are they budging at all?
They're pushing back hard against any blanket stay. They're arguing for the presumption of constitutionality, basically. A law should be assumed valid unless proven otherwise. They maintain the act is needed for reform and should stay in force while the court deliberates.
Even though they apparently hinted back in April, they might hold off on some parts.
Right, there was some indication of that earlier. But the arguments on May 20th and 21st seemed pretty forceful, suggesting they're defending the act strongly now. The fact the hearings spilled over into a second day really shows how complex and contested this is, like a cricket match going into super overs.
Definitely highlights the stakes. Okay, let's zoom out from the pure legalese. Why should people, outside of legal or religious scholars care about this? What are the real-world impacts?
Well, it's huge. We're talking about land, power, and community identity. These aren't just abstract legal points. Disputes over Waqf land can, and sometimes do, lead to real social friction.
You mentioned an incident earlier.
Yes. Tragically, in Murshidabad, West Bengal, back in April, there were violent protests reportedly linked to the act, and sadly, lives were lost. It shows just how deeply felt these issues are on the ground.
That really brings it home. And you combine that emotional connection with the immense financial value of these properties, plus the genuine problems of past mismanagement, encroachment, illegal sales, legal limbo.
Right. You can see why the government feels reform is necessary. But then you have the critical perspective, fearing that the proposed solution, more government control, might just create different problems, maybe more bureaucracy, less community connection. It's like asking your very organized but maybe slightly out-of-touch cousin to plan a huge family reunion. The intentions might be good.
But the execution might miss the mark or cause new headaches. Yeah, I get that.
Exactly. There's a real worry about unintended consequences.
Let's delve a bit more into that opposition viewpoint. What's the core feeling from those who see Waqf as deeply Islamic?
The fundamental argument is that Waqf isn't just some optional charity. It's woven into the fabric of Islamic tradition and practice for centuries. So for the government to suddenly declare it non-essential, well, that's seen as deeply insensitive, almost an attack on their heritage.
It's questioning something foundational.
Yes. And again, the issue with non-Muslims on boards isn't just about capability, it's about shared understanding and values. The concern is whether someone outside the tradition can truly make decisions that align with the spirit and purpose of the Waqf as understood by the community it serves.
Right. And I remember you mentioned online discussions about women's rights in this context, too.
Yeah, that's another layer. Some critics point out that while the act talks modernization, it perhaps doesn't go far enough in addressing gender inequality within Waqf management structures. There's a push from some quarters to ensure women have a stronger voice and role in how these community assets are governed.
So multifaceted opposition. Now, circling back to the center's defense, their main angle is positioning Waqf as primarily charitable, not core religion, right?
That's the key distinction they keep making. They focus on the charitable outcome, framing it more like general philanthropy, and argue the actual management is a secular task, like administering any large trust or foundation.
So separating the administration from the faith element, like the temple trust versus the temple rituals example we used.
Exactly. And they defend, including non-Muslims, by comparing it to, say, the diversity on sports boards or other public bodies, where specific expertise is valued over religious identity for administrative roles. And of course, they consistently stress the goal of fighting corruption and settling disputes through things like the district collector's new powers and stricter audits.
But the underlying question remains, will these measures actually clean things up effectively or just add layers of government control?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The debate is really about effectiveness versus potential overreach and bureaucracy.
It really does feel like this massive balancing act. You've got tradition versus the push for modernization, community rights versus what the center sees as national interest, and this constant tension between local autonomy and central control.
Perfectly put.
Yeah.
And we even see this playing out in federal dynamics. You mentioned reports about West Bengal's Chief Minister, Mamata Banerjee, potentially resisting the act's implementation.
Right.
That highlights how this isn't just a legal issue. It can become a point of friction between the central government and state governments, too. It touches on the very structure of governance in India.
So where are we right now, then? What's the latest status in the Supreme Court?
Well, as of our last update around May 21st, the Supreme Court hasn't issued a final ruling. The hearings were ongoing, which suggests they're really wrestling with the arguments. Remember, an earlier hearing got pushed back too, so they're clearly taking their time. It's like trying to untangle a really complicated knot. It requires care.
And the public conversation.
Still buzzing. Oh, absolutely. Social media, news commentary. It's a hot topic. You see legal experts weighing in, community members expressing anxieties, others supporting the government's reform agenda. It's a real reflection of the diverse opinions across the country.
Okay, quick detour for a bit of humor, maybe. Why did the Waqf property sue the government?
Uh-oh. Why?
Because it felt its very identity was being questioned.
Okay. A little courtroom humor there. Touches on the core issue, though.
It does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one big takeaway you think people should hold on to?
I think it's that this whole situation around the Waqf Amendment Act really forces us to look at that fundamental balancing act in any diverse modern society.
Yeah.
How do you respect deep-rooted traditions and community rights while also pursuing goals like efficiency, accountability, and national integration? There are no easy answers.
Yeah, it's definitely about way more than just land titles. It gets into fairness, power dynamics, how you preserve culture and faith in a changing world.
Exactly. And maybe the final thought to leave people with is this. If a long-standing practice like Waqf can be legally redefined by the government as non-essential, what does that mean for other religious or cultural traditions? It's a question about the line between state governance and community autonomy that's worth thinking about.
A really significant question indeed. And like you said, the story isn't over. We'll have to keep watching how the Supreme Court rules and what happens next. Thanks so much for breaking this all down today.
My pleasure. It's a complex but incredibly important issue to understand.